Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor William Zame, who is Professor of Economics and Mathematics at UCLA. His recent research includes work on the impact of culture on economic outcomes in diverse societies, informational asymmetries and macroeconomics, experimental financial markets, and a number of topics in machine learning. He is currently co-editor of Economic Theory and associate editor of Theoretical Economics. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you for having me.
Sure, yeah, thanks for doing this. So I want to start with one of your working papers that is yet to be published entitled Linking Social and Personal Preferences, in which you say the attitudes of a decision maker toward riskless and risky choices, both personal choices and social choices, enter virtually every realm of individual decision making. The paper asks when it is possible to link these attitudes. I find this paper extremely interesting, Bill. Obviously, it has implications for, as you describe here, for people who are in public office, perhaps C-level execs in large companies, and so on. And so, what do you mean by the linking personal choices and social choices?
So the idea of the paper, and it started out as a purely experimental paper, turned into a theoretical paper, and is now the paper you've seen has both a theoretical part and an experimental part. The experimental part is trying to test the theory. But the idea of the paper is that we, the decision maker is us, not just the President of the United States, but we make choices in many different domains. So we make a choice of how to divide money between ourselves and someone else. We make, and let's think of that as a social choice. We make a choice of how to choose what to do in situations that involve risk only to us. And then we also make decisions especially if we're the president or a decision maker who's making decisions for other people, we make decisions in situations where there's risk for us and for others. And the question is, that third domain seems like it's a combination of the first two domains. And if people have consistent preferences, then theory tells you that under certain circumstances, it's possible to infer choices in the third domain, preferences in the third domain, from about observations of preferences in the first two domains. Right. So the paper establishes this idea theoretically, and then there's an experiment in which in the laboratory we have student participants, as most economic experiments that are done in laboratories are done with undergraduates. And in the laboratory, we give subjects choices in the three domains, and we see, to the extent that it's possible, whether the theory looks good. And the result, I think, is that my colleagues and I don't necessarily interpret the result the same way. I interpret the results of the experiments to say that most people behave according to the theory, and a significant number of people really do not. And
so let me ask you that on that, Bill. So what does the theory predict? What does the theory say about how people should behave?
well, remember, should here is simply a matter of consistency. There's no moral judgment being applied here. We're just asking if there are people's choices in the three domains are consistent. And what the theory says is that if you can observe certain things in the first two domains, then you can completely infer what people will do in the third domain. In the laboratory experiment, it turns out that you can't always observe what you need to observe, but for some people you can. So in one part of the experiment, people are given a sum of money, and they're asked to divide the sum of money between themselves and someone else, an anonymous other person. Some people keep everything and give nothing. Let's call those people selfish. That's not a particularly good description, but let's call them selfish. So for selfish people, it should be the case that their decisions in the domain where they're mixing, there's mixture of uncertainty and social choice, should be completely determined, should be the same as in the pure social choice, in the pure risk experiment, because they don't care about others. Mm-hmm. So as far as they're concerned, if I toss a coin, comes up heads, you get $5 and I get $3. If it comes up tails, I get $5 and I get $20 and you get $1. I'm going to choose based the
5 and 3.
The 5 and 3, because the truth is, I don't care about you. I don't care about the fact that you're going to get more or less. So if I don't care
so it's
the social choices, the uncertainty in the social choices is irrelevant.
Yeah, so it's a very simple objective function, right? So essentially, all the individual has to do is to maximize the what he or she is getting, and it doesn't really matter.
I want to interrupt. So you have to keep in mind. I think I didn't say this very well. You have to keep in mind that before we toss the coin, you don't know how much you're going to be getting. You'll be either getting, depending on which outcome obtains, either you'll be getting $20 or $1, or you'll be getting $5 or $3, depending on whether the coin lands heads or tails. So you want to maximize your welfare, taking into account the payoffs and the uncertainty. Now, standard economic theory says that people should maximize expected utility. For these kinds of stakes, it seems like people should maximize their expected payoffs, but very few people do that. And in fact, behavior in these environments is very complicated, that across individuals. So people do things that are sensible, but don't look at all like what theory predicts.
Yeah, so from my own understanding, Bill, so if the coin turns up head, it's a 5 and 3 split, But ex ante, you don't know whether you're going to get the 5 or the 3,
No,
right?
yeah. So let me try again. I think I said
Yeah,
that badly. So
yeah,
suppose you were asked to choose a 5-3 split, or let's make it $8 both times, or
yeah,
a 2-6 split.
right.
Okay, you have to make a choice of one or the other. If the
Mm,
coin comes up heads and you have chosen 5-3, then you'll get 5. If you comes up heads and you have chosen 2-6, you'll get 2. If the comes up tails, you'll get either 3 or 6, depending on which you have chosen. But you have to choose first, and then the coin toss comes afterwards. So clearly, you'd
okay,
rather have $6 than $5. On the other hand, the first choice, which is the first choice where you'll get either 5 or 3, has the same expected payoff, but is less risky. So if
mm,
you are averse to risk, then you ought to choose 5-3, and not everybody does. And we've also
right,
got much more complicated choices for people to choose among.
right, right. Okay. And so from your interpretation of the experiment is that generally people do what the theory says, but there are a lot of exceptions, and hence you have to look for some explanation why that's the case.
Um, I'm not sure that that's what I'd say. Um,
Yeah.
I would say something slightly different, namely, my conclusion from this, or my inference is a better word. My inference from this is that a substantial majority of people are consistent, and
Hmm.
a substantial minority of people are internally inconsistent. Because what they do is inconsistent. They behave differently in environment A than in environment B. And this is
Hmm.
particularly important because one of the big questions about experimental economics is we conduct an experiment in the laboratory, but we're worried about what the external validity of the conclusions are. Uh,
Yeah.
People in the world behave the way they do in the laboratory, and are people in the world like the students in the laboratory at all?
Hmm.
And so
S-
the result of this experiment suggests that there are a lot of people who are inconsistent even in the laboratory. So there's no reason to think that their behavior out of the laboratory would look like their behavior inside the laboratory.
Is it because they do not know how to maximize expected returns from the experiment, or something else?
Oh, it's definitely something else, because there are people who are doing things which by theory are odd, but who are still perfectly consistent.
Hmm.
Right? So they're doing something that one might think is odd. They're maximizing something, and they're doing it in a consistent way. They're just not maximizing expected return or even expected utility.
Hmm. Is there, I hate to ask this, Bill, but is there something that says there are some people who want to um, both maximize their utility, but also simultaneously maximize the disutility for the for the society in
Well,
some way?
so one of the things that's at issue is the opposite of altruism is spite.
Yeah.
Right? And in these experiments, you do see spite.
Hmm.
The experiment, however, is set up so that it's not, you would not expect to see much spite, because the other person is anonymous to you.
Yeah.
Um, there are other experiments where you don't know literally who the person is, you don't know their name, but you've interacted with them in the past. And
Hmm.
depending on your interactions with them in the past, you may be trustful or mistrustful. You may be altruistic or you may be spiteful. And you do see altruistic behavior and you do see spiteful behavior.
right. And those behaviors appear consistent. So this is what I found interesting in your concluding remarks in the paper that you talk about character of an individual is an important sort of measurement democratic societies should think about if that person is going to become or run for public office or something along those lines, right?
Well, so I think that when we got in the middle of this paper, this project has been going on for quite a few years, more than I
Yeah,
care to admit or care to think about. Um, but in the middle of this, we were thinking very much about politics.
yeah,
And we were thinking about what many people have said, that in choosing a president, character matters above all. Um,
mm,
and so if you believe that, then the question is, can you infer from what you observe about a person's private choices enough about their character to understand something about how they will make social choices, how they'll behave in office? And
right.
the answer is there's an issue about what you can observe, but the answer is if they're consistent, then the answer is yes. And so there's a question of are people consistent?
And you found them to be consistent, right, in the experiment?
Uh, I think about 2/3 of the people are
Yeah.
pretty consistent. Uh, and I would say about 1/5 of the people, so a substantial minority, are really quite inconsistent.
Mm. And so that's so multiple things there. One is if you believe character is the governing criteria for a leader of a nation, for example, then the first question is, can you actually observe the character? Can you observe the actions of that individual in private life? And if you can, the probability of that feeding into the public life appears to be quite high.
Yes, I think so.
And so this hypothesis that character is a governing criteria for a leader seems to be the right notion.
Well, without trying to comment too much on current politics, that
Yeah,
assumes that. Let me put it differently. Um,
yeah,
there seem to be a lot of people who believe that you cannot judge how someone's going to behave in office by how they have behaved before they were in office.
mm,
Um, I would argue that you probably can if they're consistent, and there's certainly no reason to believe they'll behave better when they're in office than they have behaved in their private lives.
right. And it's not just the U.S. I think it is potentially a generally applicable idea. Now, clearly, this is not something you can operationalize in politics. I don't think, at least.
Well, it depends on what you mean by operationalize.
Yeah,
If we move away from the United States, but we move, say, to the United Kingdom,
yeah,
um, if you ask me, an observer, an interested observer, but from outside, whether Boris Johnson's behavior in office has been consistent with his behavior before he was in office, the answer is absolutely yes.
mm, right. And and so I think you could potentially say that, Bill, for most democracies, most leaders, most contemporary leaders, I think the answer would be yes. And so then the question would be, in a democratic system, are voters really taking that into account when they make their choices, or it is just a notion that is somewhat cosmetic in nature?
I think it varies a lot according to the situation, according to the candidates. If you look at past history of U.S. elections, for example, Edmund Muskie was the front runner for the Democratic nomination at some point. There was a public, not emotional attack on his wife. He defended her in public, and he was seen to be crying. People interpreted this as weakness on his part, and his candidacy sank like a stone. The best example is Gary Hart. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but
Gary, I remember.
In the year before the election, Gary Hart was thought to be the leading Democratic candidate. There were rumors circulating that he had a mistress, and he of course denied it. And in a press conference, he said, "I don't have a mistress. I lead an incredibly boring life. And if you don't believe me, follow me around."
Right.
So
and
they did follow him around, and the next day they caught him with his mistress. The next day. Right?
Right.
Now, this is a perfect example, and of course, his candidacy sank like a stone. It resurfaced a bit later because these scandals tend to be short-lived. But the thing that really got to most people was not that he had a mistress, not that he denied it, not that he was caught, but that after challenging people to follow him around, he promptly took no pains to be careful. And so this suggested that he was a very careless person. And the last thing you want in a president is a very careless person.
Yeah, but all those norms, Bill, are all out of the window if you study more recent phenomena. So I think they used to be, when I came to the US in the mid 80s, my expectation of an American president was substantially different from what it is today. And so there is a sort of a historic downgrading of expectations, I think.
I'm not so sure that that is the right interpretation. So
Yeah.
I don't know a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump either this time or 4 years ago. Not sure I know any. I mean, I know that I know some, but I've never, not that haven't talked to them about politics. So my impression of what Trump voters think is garnered from interviews that I've seen, which are not exactly random samples, and discussions in the press. My impression, or the inference I draw, is that there are two things going on with a lot of people. One is there's a tremendous distrust of media, and they get all their news from sources that are not reliable. So the set of, I mean, there's a famous quote by, I forget who, which says, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. But these people have different facts than the people who read the New York Times. So there was a survey done a couple of years ago about how informed people were as a function of where they got their news. And the people who got their news from NPR were by and large the best informed. The people who got their news from Fox News were the worst informed. And the people who watched Fox News were less well informed than the people who didn't have any news sources at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit like what I would call belief-based decision making. So the one-fifth of the inconsistency you found in the experiment, we have similar situations in corporate environments, right? Decision makers, make decisions based on gut feel, belief, and it doesn't really matter what the data might say, because the belief is going to override data. And so my observation is that this has nothing to do with education. It has nothing to do with any of the characteristics people think about, but it has everything to do with a decision process that is sort of faulty to start with.
Yes, I think that's right. I think it is correlated with education in the sense that people who have gone through certain kinds of rigorous education um, have learned to use data in reaching conclusions and to rely less on beliefs and gut instinct. But I agree with what you're saying. Um, I
Yeah.
have been interviewed a couple of times on a different show about politics, and one of the things, one of the discussions that came up, what I prefaced my remarks with, I attributed the quote to the person who made it, which is, "In God we trust. All others must bring data." But
Yeah.
it seems to me that there are a lot of people who think that what people in authority say is true, and they don't brook any disagreement with it. And the way
Mm.
they don't brook any disagreement with it is not that they take what someone in authority says and they look at the facts and find conflicts. They take what someone in authority says and they listen to a particular collection of news sources which reinforce that statement and don't allow any contrary data to be presented.
Right, right. I want to jump into another paper, Bill. So this one is entitled Asset Pricing and Asymmetric Reasoning. It's sort of tangentially related to what we're
Well, I don't
talking
think it's
about. So,
tangential at all, actually. Um, I think it's quite
yeah,
similar. It's quite in the same
yeah,
vein. So, what
right.
can I tell you about that paper?
Yeah, so I was just going to ask you to kind of set the context. So you say we present a theory and experimental evidence on pricing and portfolio choices under asymmetric reasoning. So here again, we have some expectations out of economics that people maximize, they create efficient portfolios and so on. But what we are finding here is slightly
Well,
different, right?
so let me give a little of the backstory, a little more of the backstory.
Yeah.
So, a number of people, of whom the most prominent is Eugene Fama, who got a Nobel Prize for this, um,
Right.
have asserted the idea that markets are informationally perfect. And what they mean by that
Right.
is that although people who trade in the markets begin with private information that's relevant about what the true prices of assets should be, the process of trading causes the prices to move in such a way that it reveals all the information. Now,
Yeah.
there's a lot of doubt about whether that's true. Fama has a lot of data indicating that it's true, but it's not, I don't know how to put this, it's not exactly global data. It's sort of,
Hmm.
we can observe information leaking into the market in the course of a day as the way a stock moves. So, what happens following an announcement, for example? How long will it take for the
Hmm.
effect of the announcement to make its way into prices? And announcements are not exactly private. I mean, they're public, but not everybody pays attention to them. The question is,
Yeah.
can I infer enough about what the announcement says from the fact that other people are suddenly buying a lot of stock, bidding up the price. Well, so the announcement must have been good, or people are sort of dumping it, so the announcement must have been bad. So I learned this. And there's a lot of economic theory that provides situations in which this should come to pass. That after we settle on prices, we don't necessarily all know everything, but we all know everything that's relevant to the prices. So economic theory generally thinks that information should leak into prices. And the idea is the following. Suppose that you have information that I don't have, and your information suggests that the price of this asset should be higher than it actually is.
Yeah.
When you start buying this asset, which drives the price up, I should make inferences about what you've learned. And if I know that you have information that I don't have, then my inference will be that your information is good.
Right.
Okay. Now, the problem with this argument is that my inference may be that you think that the information is good, but in my model of the world, the information is bad because I don't have the same model of the world as you do.
Right.
So that the reason that information doesn't leak into prices is not that it's hidden, it's that we interpret information differently. So in the experiment, instead of giving people private information, we give them public information, but we give it to them in a way that's hard to understand.
Okay.
And so some people understand it well and make the right inferences, and some people don't. And in settings where a very big majority of people do not know how to interpret the information, prices don't look the way they, quote, should. In situations where a big majority of people or a big chunk of people do interpret properly, everything works fine. Prices look like they're supposed to. And the complication is, do you understand that you don't understand the world, or do you think that you understand the world, but you're mistaken?
Yeah, but if there is one participant, Bill, in the market with infinite resources and the right interpretation of the data, wouldn't that participant make the prices efficient?
The answer is, provided that the other people understand that, well, sorry, let's back up a little.
Yeah.
There's a very, very nice experiment that was done a couple of years ago about asset markets, with asset markets. And the experiment found that strange things can happen in an asset market when the people in the market this is not quite right, are not very smart. So what they did is they gave people a little test beforehand, and they then took the top 15% of people who did well in this test, and they ran the experiment with those people. So now they have a room full of people, all of whom are, in this sense, smart. And what happens is basically the same thing. The market gets to, doesn't settle in the, quote, right place. So they did one more experiment. They took a sample of this 15% of people who were smart. They put them in the room, and before the experiment started, they told everybody in the room how the people in the room were selected. So now the difference is that in the last story, people in the room know that other people in the room are smart by this criterion. And now everything works beautifully. That is, information is revealed, etc. And this casts a lot of light on experiments, the original experiments which had been done at Caltech. Because the biggest difference between experiments done at Caltech and experiments done at a random university are not only that the students at Caltech are smarter, but that everybody knows the students are smarter. And when you do this experiment, as some colleagues of mine in London did, with professional traders, the same thing happens. That is, if everybody is smart, everybody is sophisticated, and everybody knows that everybody else is sophisticated. So it's not just that the market is populated by sophisticated people. The market is populated by sophisticated people who know that the market is populated by sophisticated people. So if you're in fact informed, let's go back to your question. If you're in fact well informed and you have infinite resources and you're drawing the correct inferences, in the standard story, you would in fact drive prices to where they should be. But in fact, whether or not you will drive prices to where they should be depends on whether other people interpret your actions correctly. And if they don't know that you have the same model of the world as they do, then they will not interpret your act or may not interpret your actions correctly. And the net result is that the outcome may be very, very different. And in fact, that's exactly what happens in the experiments. So it turns out what's important is, again, that there be enough smart people who can be perceived to be smart in the market. So when we do the experiment with all Caltech undergraduates, enough people figure out the truth that everything works fine. When we do it with UCLA undergraduates, it depends, but sometimes enough people figure things out. When we did it with undergraduates at the University of Utah, no one figured out what was going on, and the market gets completely screwed up. And then we mix Caltech students with Utah students. Well, that's enough smart people.
Right.
Smart is not the right
so
word, but sophisticated in a way.
Yeah. No, the difficulty for me, Bill, has always been so we don't have equal participants in the market, right? So we have some hedge funds with, hundreds of billions of dollars of assets, and we have day traders trading with $1,000. And if the hedge fund, for argument's sake, is a participant who knows efficient price, it doesn't really matter if the 10 million day traders with $1,000 observe them, interpret them, or anything, because they can take the counter trade. I'm perfectly fine if I were the hedge fund. I'm perfectly fine people, running around with with chickens their head cut off, right? I mean, it's actually a good thing for me.
Well, yes. So in many models, there are noise traders, and the noise traders are just not rational. But the setting you describe is not a realistic setting, because you think about it, there isn't one hedge fund. There are many hedge funds, and they don't all do the same thing. And the reason is that they have different models of the world. And in fact, they advertise that they have different models of the world. If everybody had the same model of the world, there would be no reason why you should there would be no reason why you should give your money to a hedge fund or to a financial advisor. You might as well just buy the market. But lots of people don't do that. And lots of hedge funds or financial advisors claim that they outperform the market. It's not clear what the evidence is. Um,
The evidence is that there is zero alpha
well,
in the market
um,
or on average.
yeah, but I think that um, Warren Buffett's operation has outperformed the market. Jim Simon's operation has enormously outperformed the market. Um,
In some regimes, though, Bill, I think, so if you sort of risk adjust returns of Berkshire Hathaway, I haven't looked at the data recently, but yeah, you can see there are periods where there is excess returns, but there are long periods of time where there is negative alpha or zero alpha
yes, but
there
I think
too.
on the whole, I mean,
Yeah,
Berkshire Hathaway isn't exactly the right comparison because Berkshire Hathaway is not actually operating like a hedge fund, you know.
yeah,
But Jim Simon's operation, Renaissance Technology, is
right.
a better example, and they have outperformed the market, not all the time, but very consistently for a long time now.
Hmm.
Um, you know, Jim Simons, who started life as a mathematician and was a world class
Yeah.
mathematician, by the way, was a very smart guy.
Hmm.
And sorry, my
No worries.
computer is telling me something happened. Um, and their algorithms seem to work pretty well. Um,
Hmm.
but at any rate, the point is that in order for the informed people to move the market to the right place, so to speak,
Yeah,
it has to be necessary either that they're sufficiently large that they're really dominating the market. I'm going to give you an example, by the way, where this wasn't true. They're sufficiently large so that they're completely dominating the market, or people believe in them. So let me give you an example
right.
where this was not true. So in the 80s, there was a very big market crash one day.
Yeah,
And the explanation of what happened went like went as follows. Many people interpreted trades as having information, large trades as having information. In fact, however, many of the large trades were being conducted by programs. They were program trading, and they had no information in them at all. So these programs were selling or even selling short, and many participants in the market took this as negative information where there was not informative at all that caused the programs to sell even more. And there was a cycle in the bottom really dropped out and really dropped out very, very quickly. And it was discovered afterwards that in that period, something like 15% of all trades were program trades, which had nothing to do with information at all. And the reaction of the people who regulate the market, regulate the New York Stock Exchange, was that program trades would have to be labeled as program trades so that you could understand what trades might be driven by information and what trades were not driven by information. So what happened in the crash was that I saw the program trading, selling. I thought the program had negative information about the true value of the asset. So I started selling as well. But I was mistaken about the program's model of the world.
Hmm. Yeah, in the status quo, though, Bill, the computer is a lot smarter than humans.
Um,
Um,
well, the question is not whether the computer is smarter than humans. I'm not even sure
yeah,
what that means. The question is the computer programmed better than humans?
yeah, it's less noisy, it's less emotional. So you can see people sitting in front of a computer trading, humans generally tend to reduce alpha significantly. that machines that are doing, sort of mindless programmatic trade, and increasingly, those computers can actually get information too and analyze that information. But one thing that I find very interesting in the paper, Bill, is that you make a distinction between ambiguity averse and risk averse
Mm-hmm.
agents. And so a risk averse agent is somebody who understands the risk. So there is certain probability of future states of the world, whereas the ambiguity averse agent doesn't like any uncertainty of anything,
Well,
right? It just wants something
I would
constant.
make a different distinction. So let's begin by
Yeah,
distinguishing what I mean by risk and what I mean by ambiguity. By risk,
yeah,
I mean situations in which either there are something very like objective probabilities, or to which we
mm,
can assign with some confidence subjective probabilities. And by ambiguity, I mean situations in which we're unsure of the outcome, or we're unsure of what's going to happen,
yeah,
we're uncertain about what's going to happen, and we can't assign probabilistic
mm,
probabilities. To be averse to risk means you don't want to take fair bets on the cost of a coin, the toss of a coin. Um,
right,
and for large stakes, most people are risk averse. But the difference between being risk averse and ambiguity averse is that although most people are risk averse, the question is, how do people behave when they're confronted with situations in which they don't know how to assign probabilities? For example,
mm,
what does it mean to say that the probability that Mitt Romney will be reelected senator from Utah is 95%? What does that mean? I
mm,
mean, I understand what it means when you say you think it's 95%, but
right,
to me, it seems quite ambiguous. And there's a lot of evidence that people do not treat situations where they can't figure out the probabilities the same way they treat situations where they can figure out the probabilities. So people can be, uh, they treat ambiguity differently than they treat risk. So they can be risk neutral,
mm,
but averse to ambiguity. And there are some people who sort of like ambiguity, just as there are some people who sort of like risk. But by
right,
and large, it seems that people who are more risk averse are also more likely to be averse to ambiguity. And the question is, in what situations will you perceive ambiguity? So if you
mm,
see that I'm behaving in a certain way, do you regard this as a risky, informing you about risk, or do you treat my behavior as ambiguous? And your reaction to it can be very different depending on whether you interpret this as risk and assign some probabilities to it, or you interpret it as ambiguous. And this is really very true in the world. Um, if I can go back to politics for a moment.
yeah, sure,
So think about um, in our invasion of Iraq.
mm,
One of the arguments for invading Iraq was that Saddam Hussein had and would be willing to use weapons of mass destruction. And
correct,
one of the arguments supporting the idea that he had weapons of mass destruction was, well, he had the opportunity to deny it and to allow inspectors to prove that he didn't have weapons of mass destruction. And he didn't take that opportunity. So that should be taken as evidence that he didn't have weapons of mass destruction. They did have weapons of mass destruction. Now,
yeah,
the problem
yeah,
with that line of reasoning is that assumes that you know what Saddam Hussein's utility function was. And the
right,
truth is, you don't. His utility function is, you know, the way he views things is, to you, ambiguous. So you can't assign probabilities to it. You have to say, well, there's some possibility, but we don't know how likely it is, that the reason he won't admit to not having weapons of mass destruction, and that he won't allow inspectors, is that'll make him look weak to his neighbors. He doesn't want to look weak to his neighbors. It's important that he looks strong, and to him, it's more important to look strong than to worry about the United States invading Iraq.
Right.
So our evaluation of Saddam Hussein should take into account that this is a situation where we can't really assign probabilities. We should think of this as ambiguous.
Yeah, I mean, this binary events, right? Yes or no events, where you don't have a lot of experiments. Assigning a probability, like you say, is sort of a futile exercise to start with. You cannot be proven wrong if I say there is a probability that world is going to, not that would be too much, but yeah, there is a probability that we're going to get. There is a probability of 65% there's going to be a third wave of COVID, right? If a third wave of COVID happens, I will say, look, I was right. If it doesn't happen, I would say there was 1/3 chance
Well,
it
in
would not
fact,
happen.
well,
And
absolutely. And in fact, the people who say all the pollsters were wrong, they're predicting Hillary Clinton would win. No, nobody predicted that Hillary Clinton would win with 100% probability. I don't think her win probability ever got above 80%. And to say that 20% 20% probability events don't happen is absurd. Of course they happen. They happen all the time.
right. Yeah, so you say, going back to the paper again, Bill, you say if the agents are ambiguity averse, these agents become price insensitive.
So,
So what do you mean there?
the question is the following.
Yeah.
If you think that the value of the asset is the true value of the asset is going to be $100 if the coin comes up heads, and $50 if the coin comes up tails, then there is a price at which you're willing to buy the asset before the coin is tossed. Presumably, you're certainly willing to pay $50. Presumably, you're certainly not willing to pay $100. But presumably, and maybe you're willing to pay 75. Maybe you're risk averse. You're willing to pay less. Let's suppose that you're willing to pay $60. And then I tell you, well, it's not a fair coin. It's going to come up heads a little more often. Say 55% of the time it's going to come up heads. Then the amount you'll be willing to pay for this asset, well, heads is a good outcome. So the amount you're going to be willing to pay goes up. And conversely, if I ask at what would you do for these prices? If the price is $75, you want to buy or sell. Well, in this case, you want to sell. The price is $55, you want to buy. And there's exactly one price at which you'll be indifferent. But if I don't tell you anything about this coin, if I say, I'm going to roll a die, and my colleague Charlie Plott had in his experimental lab a 10-sided die. Now, and if the number comes up odd, it'll be $100. If it comes up even, it'll be $50. The problem is that you don't know what the probabilities of coming up odd or even are on a 10-sided die, but there are no regular 10-sided solids. So for sure, and not for sure, but pretty much for sure, the chances of each number coming up are not the same. So the truth is that the probability distribution of this die is ambiguous to you. And you can actually do this experiment, and what you will find is, and this is what we found in a different paper, the theory tells you, and the experiment bears out, that there's a range of prices at which you want to buy, the range of prices at which you want to sell, and there's a big range of there can be a very big range of prices in the middle, in which when you hold the asset, you don't want to sell it. When you don't hold the asset, you don't want to buy it. And that's not possible if you assign probabilities.
So that is what you mean by price insensitive.
Prices move and people don't do anything.
Yeah.
And indeed, in that experiment, you see that a lot. And this is carries over into the paper we're now talking about, because when I see you taking certain actions, I don't think that you have the same model. I worry that you don't have the same model of the world as I do. Then I may interpret your behavior as ambiguous rather than good or bad. Rather than having good information or bad information, I interpret it as ambiguous. And my reaction to ambiguity is to avoid it.
Yeah, so you see sort of a similar behavior in stock market also, Bill. So if I hold XYZ company, I don't want to sell it. And there, there's a range of prices. If I don't own it, I don't want to buy it either. I think you see this in in investors,
I
this
think
type of
I think
behavior
you
too.
see that for two reasons. One is that there's ambiguity, and the other is there's what experimental economists like to call the endowment effect. That people tend to value things they own more than things they don't own, even when they're the same thing. There's some issue about to what extent the endowment effect is real, but lots of people believe in it. I mean,
There is also sort of a different version of sunk cost type thing going on there too. Suppose I buy XYZ, and even though I know, I'm holding on to a negative return, I'm not willing to accept it. And I'm just holding out for, that asset to
well,
turn to a positive side.
if you're like
Uh,
me,
yeah.
and someone taught you to play poker, in my case, a book,
Yeah.
The first thing they tell you is once the money is in the pot, it's not yours anymore. Right? So you shouldn't think that, I've got $50 in the pot, other people have $75 in the pot. So I really have a certain 40% of the pot. No, that's not true. The money isn't yours anymore. If you now have to call a $10 bet, then there'll be $135 in the pot. $145 in the pot if you call, and you have a chance of winning that. So the true probability should be computed with respect to the actual pot odds. And if you watch analyses of online poker, Texas Hold'em, the analysts talk about the pot odds all the time. And it's very important that once the money is in the pot, it's not yours. So this is the sunk cost fallacy. And part of the reason I think that people fall prey to this is it's a combination of not understanding sunk costs, but it's also the case that people are very reluctant to admit they made a mistake. But I want to say one other thing. So,
yeah,
if you read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is a very interesting book, you see that Kahneman has fallen prey to a very bad, he's made a very bad mistake. Namely, he has violated the dictum, in God we trust, all others must bring data. So the psychologists, Kahneman in particular, but the psychologists generally do experiments by questionnaire, by asking people what they would do. And Kahneman in his book even says something to the effect that there's no reason to think that people would do something different than what they say. My reaction to that is, this is an empirical question. So why don't we ask people what they would do and then give them the opportunity to actually do it? and see if they do what they say. And guess what? They don't.
They don't. Yeah.
And so economists do not believe in this kind of experiment. In experiments, what economists do is they make people, or they allow people to make decisions, and typically real money is involved. Because you can't say, what would you do if I offered you $100? I have to offer you $100. And it is true that there's no particular reason why these should be different, but this is not a theoretical question. This is an empirical question. And you shouldn't confuse theory with data. So part of the trouble with experiments is that it's this stored thing we're coming back to what we were discussing earlier on, which is external validity. I do an experiment with students, but the market is not populated by students. I do an experiment where, in the first experiments, my colleagues and I did the first financial experiments, the average profit was something like $200 over the course of 3 hours. And some people made as much as $400. But in the market, we're not talking about hundreds of dollars. We're talking about, even for ordinary investors, tens of thousands of dollars. And for people running funds, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's not at all clear that people, first of all, they're different people. And secondly, it's not at all clear they would behave the same way out in the world.
Right. And if it is your job, if you're running a hedge fund, your behavior is going to be, not determined, but influenced by your experience. And you're doing it over and over again. You have a lot of different experiments that you have run, whereas a student hasn't done that.
I would like to make an objection to what you just said, however. If you're running a hedge fund and you've done lots and lots of experiments, then some of them will have turned out badly. And if the right ones or the wrong ones turn out badly, you won't be running the hedge fund anymore. Because people, the investors, typically do not take a very long view. So one of the issues with people running companies, for example, not just investing in stocks or assets, but making financial decisions for the company, is the people running companies are going to be judged by what's happening now, not whether what they did was likely to be correct 70% of the time. They're unlucky, they're going to lose their jobs. So there's a tendency to be sometimes overly cautious. And it used to be said that no acquisitions person was ever fired for buying equipment from IBM. Of course, that's a very old story, but why was that? Well, because you're doing what everybody else is doing. It's hard to go wrong. It's hard to be blamed for doing what everybody else is doing. If you decide to buy from an upstart company and it works out, that's fine. If it doesn't work out, you're going to get fired.
Yeah. I want to touch on one other thing before you close, Bill. And so you say in the paper again, without aggregate risk, mispricing decreases as the fraction of price-sensitive agents, increases. So first of all, what do you mean by aggregate risk in that context?
I think that we mean two things. One is that the prices adjust to aggregate what the market thinks is the true risk. So you have an opinion of the true risk. I have an opinion of the true risk. The man behind the tree has an opinion of the true risk. And the price somehow aggregates these beliefs or these opinions. That's one thing. And the other thing is that it aggregates the risk in that it shares the risk. So instead of you're bearing all the risk is shared between you and me. And at equilibrium, at least if people are sufficiently similar, the risk is shared among people. And if the market operates properly, then more risk will be borne by people who are less averse to risk, and less risk will be borne by people who are more averse to risk. So, if I may take a particular example, the University of California has a defined benefit pension plan.
Yeah.
Defined benefit plans are very unpopular these days. However, there's a very, very good justification, theoretical justification for them, which is the general principle is that in dividing risk, you should assign more, what's efficient is to assign more risk to the party that's less risk averse and less risk to the party that's more risk averse. Well, the stock market bounces up and down, and you don't get to choose exactly when you get to choose exactly when you're going to retire, but you're probably not going to get to choose in which 5-year window you retire. And if you retire in a 5-year window in which the market is down and you have a defined contribution plan, you have to take your contributions out, then you're subject to a lot of timing risk. On the other hand, if you have a defined benefit plan, then the university is subject to the timing risk. But the university can average over time. So the university is just like an insurance company, much less risk averse than you are, much less subject to this, this risk, this timing risk matters a lot less than the university.
Right.
So aggregating risk is also about assigning the risk efficiently, and prices are supposed to do that.
Okay. Yeah, we didn't get your other papers, Bill. Perhaps we can do
I'd be
another
delighted.
one.
But
This has
I
been
think the
great.
experiment. I think the experiments. I mean, I got into doing experiments quite by accident, but I have found it
Yeah.
extremely rewarding for lots of reasons. Not least because I've really enjoyed the interactions with my colleagues, and I've learned a lot from
Yeah.
them. I learned a lot from Peter Bossarts. I learned a lot about how to think about data, which I had never really done before, and that's really stood me in good stead. But it's very interesting, I think, to see the extent to which theory works or doesn't work in the laboratory.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is not something, something that we get typically, right? There are some established notions of how markets work, how people make decisions, and so on. And so these experiments are really insightful. Either you're going to confirm the theoretical expectations, or you're going to find some deviations, and those deviations are going to be more interesting to
Yeah, so
explore
early
than,
on,
yeah,
when we were doing the first experiments and I was giving talks about them, people were saying, why do we have to do experiments? We have all this wonderful data. So the CRSP, the CRISP tapes, record every
yeah,
transaction on the New York Stock Exchange since about 1962. And you think, well, this is wonderful, except the data is in some ways incredibly good, in some ways incredibly bad. If you want to take that data to the economic theory as opposed to the financial theory, so the financial theory is talking about the prices of derived assets. Economic theory is talking about the prices
yeah,
of fundamental assets. You can't take it to the economic theory because what you need in the economic theory is you need to not know just you need to know not just 10,000 shares were traded at $1.25. You need to know who bought them and who
right,
sold them. And you need to know what their holdings were. And you never see that in the data. So you can't see that except by doing experiments.
right. Excellent.
Thank
Thanks so
you.
much, Bill. I really
Me
enjoyed
too.
our
Thank you very
conversation.
much. Take care.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Bye bye.
Bye. This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.